Hi, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on the influence of finance on political campaigns. My name is Colin, and I am joined here today by Carol and Matt. Together, the three of us represent the Cavalier Campaign Consulting Group. Our vision as an organization is to use data science to guide tomorrow's leaders as they seek to challenge the political landscape. In order to do this, we plan to build a predictive model that provides politicians with an accurate assessment of their probability to winning an election. As we build out this predictive model, we believe our influence will be seen not only by candidates and campaign managers, but also voters, donors, and policymakers. Now I'll send it over to Matt to walk through our agenda for today.
Thanks, Colin. We will begin with background on the topic of campaign finance, explain the dataset, data cleaning, and exploratory findings, then discuss the model building process, selection and validation, and conclude with key findings and results and recommendations. Historically, Congress has a very low job approval rating, but a very high re-election rate. In 2016, Congress had a 19% job approval rate, but were re-elected in 96.7% of races. How and why does this happen? The key factor is money. The candidate with the most campaign funds usually wins, while the cost of winning has increased over time. In 2016, 95% of House election winners had more money than their opponent, while the cost has increased from $500,000 to over $2 million, creating a barrier to entry for local candidates with limited financial support. This gives incumbents a major advantage as they have existing campaign funds from prior election that they've won, plus support from the party. And having won an election, they have voter awareness and some name value. Sometimes there's bias in the district favoring a certain party, and that could get even more biased with gerrymandering and redistricting in favor of the current office holder. So all this works against the challengers who must raise significant funds in order to be competitive. So looking at our data, which combines campaign finance information with election results from the 2016 election. There were 435 House elections and 35 Senate races. The data shows contributions from individuals, from party, and then how they spent their funds. It includes certain categorical variables such as party affiliation, where the race was, whether the candidate was incumbent, challenger, or open, and then the result of the election, whether they won or not, which is our response variable. So we did have an issue with our data since observations are not independent, and winning incumbent means losing challenger. So we focused on challengers, where winning is a rare event of just 2.1%, 15 winners out of 713 candidates for 396 races. We did have to do some data cleaning, as most of the variables in the data set were characters. So remove dollar signs, convert to numerical data types, convert categorical variables to factors, set the reference classes. In the case of party, there are 25 different classes, and we ended up collapsing to just 2, Republican or not Republican. And we created a new regional variable based on the states. And then we searched for outliers based on the length of campaign, as some candidates lost in the primary or did not raise enough funds to have a realistic chance of winning and dropped out early. So key factor again is money, total contributions. And in the case where an incumbent lost and a challenger pulled off the upset, they were able to match the campaign contributions. Again, on average, money is a key factor. Winning challengers receive 1.5 million more in contributions than losing candidates. In the data exploration, we grouped by some of the variables and saw that winning challengers end up raising more than incumbents who won by about 15%, and incumbents did end up saving some of their contributions, only spent 70%. And this suggests that they do have a war chest of existing funds expect to be reelected and can continue to build their campaign balance. Grouping by party, winning Republicans outraised Democrats by 12%, and winning Democrats only spent about 2/3 of their contributions, suggesting Republicans are more efficient with their campaign funds. Grouping by region, candidates in the South raised 20% less than candidates in other regions, suggesting it's a little cheaper to win in the South. And how these findings suggest that we may consider interaction terms in the model building process, which I'll hand off to Carol to discuss more.
Thanks a lot, Matt. So our objective in building our model was to identify the model that would have the best out of sample performance to predict if a challenger wins an election to the House of Representatives. We focused on the 4 predictors that Matt highlighted in the exploratory data analysis. These were total contributions, operating expenses, party, and region. To select the model, we followed 2 main pathways. First, we analyzed a set of just first order models. These are models that have no interaction terms or higher order polynomials. These models were largely developed on the training data set, which was 50% of our sample, totaling about 356 observations. We used R step function for this, adapted to logistic regression. STEP uses forward and backward selection to find the best model. Using forward selection as an example, the process starts with an intercept only and then adds different variables based on the AIC of the regression. The AIC basically strikes a balance between explanatory power and complexity. It's like the adjusted R squared in that it penalizes the addition of extra error terms to the model unless they add to the explanatory power. Out of all the models that we looked at, the one with the minimum AIC only included contributions. No other variables were significant in the presence of contributions. Another modeling pathway was to look at interaction terms. This was not done with the automated step procedure, but with a manual process involving mostly the full data set of about 700 challengers. Using a series of delta G2 tests, we eliminating net operating expenses and region from consideration. As in the first modeling pathway, total contributions was the dominant predictor. It performed much better than any other single predictor. We also found a positive interaction term between Republican Party affiliation and contributions. This was the best fitting model in the full data set, and it implies that a challenger winning, that a Republican would have an additional benefit of receiving a contribution compared to a Democrat. Next slide, please. This next slide shows the results from fitting our 2 models. Here, I am reporting results from the models when they are run on the training data set only, as opposed to looking at the full data set. So looking at the first order models, the results suggest that a $10,000 increase in contribution increases the predicted odds of victory by a factor of 1.019, regardless of party. If we look at the model with the interaction terms, a $10,000 increase in funding increases the odds by a factor of 1.072 for a Republican and 1.017 for a Democrat. One thing to note about these numbers is that the probability and odds of a challenger winning is a very rare event. So for this reason, odds and probabilities are very close. Whereas if we were talking about events that were not so rare, our odds and probabilities could be very different. Another thing to note is that you can see that these are very small numbers. These impacts are quite small, but they can become very meaningful if you're looking at realistic contributions, which can total in the millions. To validate our model, we examined ROC curves. A ROC curve indicates the false positive rate, which is also called one minus specificity, and the true positive rate, or the sensitivity, for every threshold for classifying the predicted values as successes. As the threshold decreases, more predictions are classified as positive. So there are more true positives, but there's also more false positives. Similarly, as the threshold increases, sensitivity will worsen, but there will be better specificity. Along the diagonal line, the model's classification of success is independent of the actual value of success. In other words, it's like fitting a coin, which is a very weak model. So the models that we have do a very good job of predicting outcomes at different threshold levels. If you look at the first order model, at a threshold of 0.2, we have correctly identified virtually all the winners. There are many false positives at higher thresholds, however, so if a candidate is risk averse, we would advise them based on lower thresholds.
Thanks, Carol. On this slide, we have a table that compares various measurements in evaluating our model. Based on the area under the curve, we can see that each of our models predicts the winning candidate at a much higher rate than random choice. In comparing the deviances, we find that our normal confidence level of 95%, we would fail to reject the null hypothesis and conclude that the first order term model is better. However, at a 90% confidence level, we would reject the null hypothesis and conclude that the model with interaction terms is appropriate. Additionally, when using the full data set to train the model, we find that the interaction term does become significant at 95%. Given such tight comparisons between the two models in the area under the curve and residual deviances, we have chosen to move forward with the model with an interaction term due to its lower AIC. The model with interaction terms is more likely to minimize information loss than the first order model. Now that we have selected our model, we would like to walk you through an example of how our model may assist one of our clients here at Cavalier Campaign Consulting Group decide whether they should run for office. Here we have one of our clients, Cavman, trying to evaluate his probability of winning a seat in the House. Due to the influence of Thomas Jefferson, Cavman is part of the Jeffersonian Party. In the context of our model, the Jeffersonian Party will be coded as Democrat_other to indicate that he is non-Republican. In his attempt to overthrow the incumbent in District VA5, Cavman has indicated that he'd like to know what amount of money he would need to raise to give himself a probability of winning greater than 50%. In this instance, Cavman would need to raise $2.925 million in order to tip the scales in his direction. To give you a sense for the impact of political party on probability, here we can see that 50% probability of winning for Cavman would be achieved at $1.23 million if he were a Republican. The influence of a dollar in the Republican Party seems to be much greater than in the Democratic Party. Part of this goes back to our exploratory data analysis, where we saw that a much larger percentage of raised money in the Republican Party is actually used for that current campaign than it is in the Democratic Party. We believe the insights we've gained from this project have an impact on three primary groups. As a voter or donor, we believe that it is important to note that funds donated to challengers will have a higher likelihood of contributing to the campaign. We recommend that donors contribute to candidates that they know have a plan to raise enough money to remain in the race, and recommend that voters start to shed light on the massive influence finances play in campaign results, encouraging other voters to seek out candidates without financial backing. As a candidate, it is important to have an understanding of how much money it will take to compete and have a detailed plan from the start to raise the full amount of money necessary. Finally, we have two recommended policies that we believe would have a positive impact on elections. The first is to consider implementing term limits in order to decrease the influence of incumbent money that continues to carry over from one election to the next. The second is to incentivize candidates to refund excess donations back to the donors. That concludes our presentation. Thank you for listening.